Hey, how's it going? Today we're going to jump into why Mark chapter 10, verses 2 through 12 is not a rejection of all divorce and remarriage, even though when you read it at first, it really sounds like it. So let's go ahead and jump into it. And before we do, just a little bit of background. Historically, and even recently, when people argue over scriptural interpretation of whether the New Testament permits remarriage after the case of divorce, a lot of people will point to Mark chapter 10 because it seems like a universal rejection of all remarriage. And so if it's shown to be otherwise, it's a serious hit to the position that there is no remarriage permitted after divorce. So let's go ahead and jump in. Mark chapter 2 or chapter 10 verses 2 through 7. Here we go. And Pharisees came up and in order to test him asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away." Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart he wrote you this commandment. From the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife." The passage continues on. "And the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." And in the house, the disciples asked him again about this matter. And he said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. If she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." So again, understandably, that sounds completely universal, right? It sounds like Jesus is ruling out all divorce and remarriage. But when we look closer, some really interesting things come to the surface. The first of these is that Mark chapter 10, verses 2 through 12 is a parallel to Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 12. We can see this on the surface because there's similarity of events. It's Jesus and the Pharisees, the similarity of the nature of the conversation, right? They're asking about divorce, particularly. We can see from context, they're asking about interpretation of the divorce passage in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. But importantly, in both Matthew and Mark, this interaction between Jesus and the Pharisees is followed by the exact same two events. So it actually is part of a block of the same three stories in both Matthew and in Mark. And so this shows us that these things, since this interaction happens in the same context in both Matthew and in Mark, they must be the same interaction, right? And this might seem kind of like a small point to make, but when we recognize that, it begins to open the door for some very significant comparisons between the two tellings of this story, Matthew's and Mark's. So to look at one example in particular, look at Mark chapter 10, verse 2, and then Matthew chapter 19, verse 3. So in Mark it says, "And Pharisees came up in order to test him and asked, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?' Then Matthew chapter 19 says, "And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, 'Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?'" So in Matthew's telling of this event, he gives us the insight that what's really happening here is it's a debate. They're asking Jesus to weigh in on a debate about a divorce that was prevalent at the time called the any cause divorce. It was popularized by a rabbi shortly before the time of Jesus and had taken off greatly. It gained a lot of traction, very similar to what we see as the no-fault divorce in our day. But basically, what was argued by this rabbi named Hillel was that the Mosaic permission for divorce under the Old Covenant gave permission for a man to divorce his wife for any cause. So famously, this could even be if she burnt the toast, right? And so what's happening here is the Pharisees are asking Jesus to weigh in on this any cause debate. We can't quite see that as clearly in Mark just by itself, but recognizing that they're telling the same story, and we see that that's definitely the story Matthew is telling when we look at historical context, then it must be the story that Mark is telling too. And that point is very significant. It's especially significant because that means that in context, Mark is using just the word divorce as a shorthand for divorce for any cause. When we read that back into what we see Mark saying later as he retells what Jesus said, that drastically changes how we read verses 11 through 12. So In the first little sentence there, that's just how it was when we read it before. But with this new insight, let's read it in the second sentence we see there. So, and he said to them, whoever divorces his wife for any cause and marries another commits adultery against her. If she divorces her husband for any cause and marries another, she commits adultery. This sounds totally different. We see then that Jesus isn't precluding the legitimacy of all divorce and remarriage. He's precluding the legitimacy of remarriage after a divorce on improper grounds, namely grounds that are put forth in the any cause divorce viewpoint. So this becomes really significant because we see then that Jesus is rejecting the any cause divorce. And we see elsewhere in Matthew chapter 19 that he only gives one legitimate ground for divorce, which is sexual immorality. And so this has huge rhetorical impact as we look at the debate between these two positions. The view that says there's no remarriage will try to use Mark 10 as a point in favor of their view. But we can say too, we can look at the other side and say, well, Mark isn't rejecting all remarriages. Jesus in Mark instead is just rejecting remarriages after divorces for faulty grounds or faulty causes. And this is what Jesus is speaking out against. Not all divorces where legitimate reasons have taken place. So this drastically shifts the nature of the conversation. But if you disagree with that, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What holes do you see in what I just said? What sort of arguments do you have against it? Either way, may God bless you in your study. Looking forward to hearing from you.